and we're talking about the environment, God's creation. And in God's Word, we clearly see who is orchestrating the universe. And God did, in fact, create the earth that so it would not run out of the essential resources that mankind needs. Our God is good all the time, and He gave us plenty of resources for humans to develop. God created an earth that He pronounced to be very good. Abundant resources that would bring great benefit to mankind. Now, there is no hint, no real concrete evidence that mankind will exhaust the earth's resources by developing and using them wisely. You know, the secret power of God is unfathomed and unsearchable. Just look how the mighty stars of the universe preserve their distance, their motion and order. How the planets that roll in the same circle as us and gravitate toward each other according to their quantity of matter. You know, the answers and simple truth are shown in the sacred pages of Scripture. It says He stretches out the north over the empty space and hangs the earth upon nothing. Christ created all things, and that includes all the mountains, the seas, the valleys, yes, and even the trees that we all enjoy. You know, I had a chance to, like some of our listeners, probably to see the movie Avatar. And it really didn't surprise me. It was a new age pagan worldview, very strong, radical, environmentalist content, promoting actually the worship of a tree worship, and presenting people as greedy. But, you know, there's nothing new under the sun, because in the 7th century, a great missionary named Boniface struggled with the same pagan worldview. And while in a place called Hesse, Germany, Boniface, who was called the Apostle of Germany, came to a city where he found a great oak tree sacred to Thor, the German god of thunder. And the people were worshiping this false god under this tree. They regarded this oak with feelings of deepest reverence. And it was under its shadow that they met to worship. Now, as the story goes, in vain Boniface preached to them on the vanity of idols. And finally, he decided to teach them an object lesson. With some of his helpers, he approached the tree with a large axe. And the pagan people stood around with great excitement. And when the first blow fell on the sacred tree, they expected that Thor, this false god, would strike Boniface dead. Instead, as the ancient story goes, a sudden gust of wind, powerful wind, rent the tree into 4 parts, which Boniface cut up into planks for the building of a church. Well, the people's faith in the power of this false god vanished away, and they can no longer believe in its teachings. And Boniface led many of them to Christ. And he built a great monastery there, and it was just a good ending to a story. And Marshall, you have seen this type of radical environmentalism in California, haven't you?
Well, exactly. And the people today don't understand this ancient paganism that is coming back in the form of environmentalism. It has a lot of bad stuff to go with it. People forget what life was like in ancient Germany. When this Scottish missionary, Boniface, marched in without an army, just with a cross and a robe and a Bible, he marched in and converted the German people, the Visigoths, the Goths, these wild men who believed in taking 15-year-old girls that they had trained to be virgins until 15, and then they bring the Vestal Virgin, the ancient rites of these pagan civilizations, into the sacred groves, and they would cut their hearts out and lay them down, and the druid, the priest, would stand over them with a knife and pray, and then cut their hearts out while their hearts were still beating. They would lift the heart up to everyone, and this would dedicate the grove and dedicate the crops the next year. So this was a great crop thing. Not so good for the 15-year-old girl, but, good for the crops. Well, this kind of ancient debauchery was practiced in every one of the ancient Eastern religions, and it included human sacrifice, abortion on a massive scale in Greece, in Rome, in Egypt. It involved totalitarian dictators. It involved the dictators taking dominion over as many other lands as they could. Instead of producing out of their own crops, they would go and steal the crops of others and steal the nations of others. That's the way the ancient world worked under these ancient pagan religions. But when Christianity came in, it changed the course of these pagan peoples, like the Vikings, who wandered stealing and raping all over northern Europe, and turned them into a Christian civilization. What does that mean? That means they have their own land. That means people individually own the land. That means they become productive. That means they become accountable to God to love their neighbor as themselves, so they don't cut the hearts out of Vestal virgins. In fact, it was Saint Boniface who ran into that grove that day because of a little boy who warned him that his sister was being cut up. And he ran and threw his body between the knife and the girl and caught the knife, took the knife away from the priest and threw the priest up against the tree, and then preached the gospel to the people that were there by the thousands, and said, "This is not a sacred grove. Go cut these trees down and to make them into logs." This is where we get the whole idea of having trees and logs and cutting down and using them for productive purposes. The idea of worshiping trees and these ancient pagan rites are not just pagan. They destroy all that they touch. This religious worldview is very destructive, whereas the Christianity that came in, it wasn't perfect because men are sinful and they do bad things too. But for the most part, what we see is the development of England and France and Scotland and all these different countries all the way up to America that became increasingly productive. Increasingly, they loved the women and the children and stopped killing them. They love babies. They love education, and so you have the development of universities. All this took place because of a Christian civilization. Now, today, in the 21st century, these teams of unbelievers are literally trying to fight off Christian civilization and destroy America as it was founded as a Christian nation. And that's what this is all about, if you want to get to the core of it.
And it's really quite a sad statement because it's a rejection of the character of God. When we think about what it says in Genesis 1:26, that we've been created in the image of God, we obviously do not have the capability of creating ex nihilo, but we have the same creative capacities in our mind to design and build and create technology and buildings and all type of things that benefit, just as the created earth that God made benefited us. And what a rejection of what a wonderful concept, the fact that we are created in God's image, we have this ability to build and create things, versus a system that says we're going to do all the awful things that you just described, Marshall, which the ancient Mayans did the same thing, and sacrifice people to the creation instead of take what the Creator has given us as an image implanted on us and build and create great things. What an incredible distance between the two. One builds a great benefit to mankind. One is totally destructive to mankind, and that is exactly the pattern of history. And Marshall, you were tapping on that over history, if you look at the ancient civilizations, as I said earlier, people were just struggling to get enough bread and food to eat for a day, let alone print enough books to read and learn to read. And then what we see is this Christian theology, this creative impact of God on his people, that suddenly we see technology and we see capital being built into technology, and we see the population grow and be productive and then have a positive impact on the world. And that's exactly what Boniface brought to those Goths and those other Druid-worshipping people. He brought a productive, prosperous life that, in fact, created some very great civilizations who shaped the world.
And you know, the importance, because I want to talk about something here, the importance of using information, you know, from long-term, you know, worldwide trends, you know, rather than a short-term local story or a disaster. It's created all these vague impressions that people have. And some people have developed their opinions not from actual data, showing the true state of the earth as a whole, showing long-term trends. But from a barrage of media reports about some specific local incident where something did go wrong, like an oil spill or a crop failure, or a polar bear jumping off a piece of melting ice in the summer in the Arctic. But we should always keep this in mind, that newspapers need to sell newspapers. They need readers. TV programs need viewers. And fear is one of the great ways of increasing an audience. And this is what's happening, guys. A lot of this stuff is just created because this general observation that people have that are, for example, like you said, Marshall, that our resources are scarce, which is not true. This is done by a number of existing special interest groups, organizations, that raise money to keep themselves employed. And they only do this by putting out these press releases declaring that there's some worldwide environmental disaster coming, like Al Gore did with the rising of the sea statement to 20 feet, that the IPCC totally said is totally wrong, based on wrong assumptions. And there's numerous examples that they have proven that their blatant, dishonest use of data that these publications and environmentalist organizations are using, such as Greenpeace, World Watch Institute, and they've been exposed. In fact, for one example, the National Organization of the United Nations that keeps an eye on the global forest, they said our forests actually have increased from 30.04% to 30.9% over a decade. Forests are actually growing. And the other thing that irritates me, guys, because I still have a son in college, and one of his books called Living in the Environment, it just had wrong facts, wrong assumptions. So my point is, we need to find some reliable data to show the long-term trends of the Earth's resources, and not react to some photograph of a polar bear jumping off a piece of ice in the Antarctic in the summer to take a dip. You know what I mean?
Right. And you know, the solution, and as we're winding down here this evening, think about what is the solution to this problem that we face. Is it government intervening in our lives, taking away our private property, and becoming the being, this separate being that must be neutral and good, of course, that will take care of us and will determine who is environmentally right and who is environmentally wrong? Of course, the governments have done that since the beginning of the world, and they end up cutting people's hearts out. They end up taking dominion like the Nazis did in World War II. Government is a terrible fire, and it burns you easily, according to Washington. And it was Ronald Reagan that said, government is not the solution, government is the problem. The solution really goes back down to what I was teaching my grandchildren down in San Diego this weekend when I was with them. It's something called, Jesus saying, do unto others what you have them do unto you, right? And that little saying has become a center focus of Christian civilization. You do things to help others, not to destroy the environment, not to make your land or your pollution go to somebody else's land. You want to do unto others as you'd have them do unto you. the more Christian a civilization becomes, the cleaner the streets become, the better the technology so people live better and that babies live longer and vaccines are created. And that happens because of the love of God in the hearts of individuals. The solution to potential environmental problems in the future is the development of Christian character in the present. And that happens through mothers and fathers and grandchildren sitting down with their children and teaching people to love their neighbor as themselves. And that will solve the major environmental problems and allow us then to move out and become productive and produce much more than we could for ourselves so that we can feed our neighbor, so that we can clothe him. So if there's a need and there's poor all over the world, we can help them with produce and we can help them develop their own developmental produce. But all of that happens through a love that comes from Christian civilization. Let's don't throw out the baby with the bathwater, and that's what these environmentalists are telling us to do. Throw away Christianity because this Christian Puritan work ethic has caused you to produce too much, and now you're destroying Mother Earth. That is the lie from the pit of hell. It is the production and the love of God that will cause things to get better, not worse.
Look at countries that have tried that system, John and Marshall. The Soviet Union, clearly a very polluted nation at this time. The government did not clean things up. They made it worse. China today. I mean, we could go through numerous examples. These cultures did not build a pristine environment because once the money went to the government did not allocate it in a way that was judicious and loving, as Marshall just put it, because people don't have any real innate value. They are just a cog in the wheel. So I didn't mean to interrupt there, John, but I just thought I needed to add that we've tried all that stuff, and it's never worked. You could go into ancient culture, the Indus Valley culture of part of India, where their government system cut and made so many trees into firewood so they could cast them into glazed brick that they deforested their entire culture. And in fact, the culture disappeared. So again, if you leave the simple rules of supply and demand and you leave God's creative genius in the hands of people, not the government, there is a natural balancing that occurs there because people will see the supply and demand curve moving. They'll respond to it with their capital toward technology, and they'll build better things to use it more efficiently.
If you'd like to contact us or you have any comments, go on the web to thestoryofliberty.net. That's thestoryofliberty.net. This global warming controversy we always hear about is mostly focused on CO2, carbon dioxide. And I don't think people understand this at all, Dan, that, what is carbon dioxide? And I know it's a colorless and kind of odorless gas. I was having a drink of Canada Dry yesterday, and I seen it on the can there. It's, that's what causes the bubbles in the can. And it's also, an organic material, such as when wood burns in a fire, it releases CO2. Of course, it's also released, when coal or gasoline or natural gas burns and released into the atmosphere. And also, when we breathe, we inhale and exhale CO2, right? Every breath. In fact, all insects, animals, people emit carbon dioxide when they exhale. And in addition, the oceans and volcanoes and all other natural sources emit it too. And it's an essential part of God's wise arrangement for life on Earth. Carbon dioxide is also crucial for plants, right? Because they need it in that process of photosynthesis that uses light energy to produce, various compounds necessary for a plant to live and grow. You learned that in high school, right? But my point is, this has been twisted so much because it's a wonderful cycle of nature that has been designed by God. And animals and people continually use up oxygen and release carbon dioxide for plants to use. And then plants use up the carbon dioxide and release oxygen for people and animals to use. It's a wonderful cycle, and the environmentalists have made it into a bad word, haven't they?
Yes, they have. Think about their words. The population bomb. What do bombs do? They explode. It then became the population explosion. Humans are a parasite. Their presupposition, in other words, their impact in the formula of pollution is always bad. But the reality is pollution is a byproduct of the means of production, the means of technology, the means of making things. And the issue of pollution isn't always, quote, bad. It's just a natural attribute of that process. And then it's a matter of how do you handle that pollution. You made it so clear. If you had greenhouses, if people had greenhouses, they would understand that some of these things that we talk about as so bad are partially what make greenhouses work. Plant material needs the emissions so that they can reprocess it into oxygen. And, of course, the oxygen is something we breathe and we need. So, when you take a step back and you try to understand the worldview of these people in the environmental movement, they have replaced God with the earth and the created elements. And so everything that doesn't make that feel good is what's bad. So there is a redefinition of terms that needs to occur here, and that's something that Christians need to begin doing. When they see this formula, impact equals population times affluence times technology, they have to start thinking differently. Well, what do you mean? What makes the impact bad? Because the radical environmentalist sees everything that's bad with respect to that impact. They never see the positive progress. As I mentioned earlier, if we actually look at the cost of wheat, the cost of oil, the gallon of gasoline, all these different elements, as technology and capital and population have grown, in fact, when you take away inflation, you take away the transaction of money from nation to nation and cartels, you take those out, the actual cost on those products has gone down. We have more freedom because these products are produced cheaper, thus we have to work less hours to have our basic needs met. As you bring population, affluence, and technology down, we find ourselves in a straw hut burning dung to cook our food and heat and dealing with all the very respiratory problems that these environmentalists under LEED certification are trying to solve. The key is we need to continue to grow the population by having children, as Marshall said, and all the children that God would give you. We need to continue to take taxes and get rid of them and allow people to have their capital and invest it in the different technologies and productions that will continue to build good things. And then, in fact, the impact on our culture, including pollution, will be either dealt with, paid and dealt with. In other words, poor countries don't deal with pollution because they have no money to deal with pollution because they're trying to feed themselves, clothe themselves, and house themselves.
Right.
Whereas the nations that have affluence, they have the ability to do things to counter those pollution issues that do occur. And that should be the perfect example. You look at the ex-Soviet Union. When that collapsed, what did they find? Rivers polluted with lead, smog, you name it, they had it.
And this controversy over global warming is, like you said, Marshall, is to a very large degree a controversy over human liberty. And that's why we call this the story of liberty, because it's just bigger government. When liberal politicians continually seek more government control because their enlightened government officials can run people's lives better than people can. And people will flock to these global warming crusades, for example. It's a mechanism by which government can control more people's lives. And to quote the president of the Czech Republic, here's what he said in his opinion about global warming and the campaign to reduce carbon dioxide. It provides the greatest threat to human liberty that has come on planet Earth since communism. Folks, thank you for the Story of Liberty. You can contact us at thestoryofliberty.com. Have a good evening. God bless you. Thanks for joining in. Good night.